This is Hart Hagen in Louisville, Kentucky with the Climate Report. The Biden administration has released new guidelines for electric cars. They hope to promote the use of electric cars such that by 2030, we have about half electric cars on the road. So far, like last year, only about 7.6% of cars were electric, the new cars sold. So let's look at this article by the New York Times, which, tells the story. But first, let me give you a preview of what I think we're going to see, at least what I want to point out. And that is that electric cars are just business as usual, that they're supposed to be this big innovation. But like the saying goes, the more things change, the more they stay the same. Electric cars are just business as usual in the following ways. Electric cars are business as usual in terms of energy consumption. You still have a growing economy that is consuming massive amounts of energy. And when humans have a lot of energy at their disposal, then humans are able to do what humans do with energy, which is a lot of destructive stuff. There is this myth that says humans need a whole lot of energy in order to thrive. I think that's a myth. That's 90% myth and only 10% true. We do benefit from energy, but how much of the benefits of this energy are for average, regular people, and how much of it is just for a small ruling elite class to do what they want, including extracting and exploiting from everything else? So electric cars are supposed to reduce our emissions by having less coming out of the tailpipe, but they do represent still a massive amount of energy consumption. If you look at the amount of pollution and the amount of carbon emissions and the amount of energy responsible that each car is responsible for, about 2/3 of the pollution, this is from an economist by the name of Richard Smith, says that 2/3 of the pollution that a car is responsible for occurs before it rolls off the assembly line. So if we want to reduce pollution, we can't just look at how much pollution is generated during the useful life of this automobile. We have to look at the manufacturing process and the disposal process, and not just what's coming out of the tailpipe. You have to look at road building, etc. So electric cars represent business as usual in relation to energy consumption, business as usual in relation to an expanding economy, business as usual in relation to pollution, especially the pollution that comes from mining, because mining is a hugely polluting process. And electric vehicles need a lot of metals. They need rare earth metals. They need lithium, nickel, cadmium. They need aluminum. They need some steel. They need copper. So you have to mine a lot of metals in order to make an electric car or any device. You have to mine a lot of metals to make a cell phone, a laptop, an electric vehicle, a solar panel, a wind turbine. All these things take massive amounts of metals. So we have to count the true cost and not just be governed by emotionally potent oversimplifications, in the words of Reinhold Niebuhr. And I might get to that quote in a little bit. Well, let me go ahead and see if I can pull up that quote real quick. So Reinhold Niebuhr, he was a theologian of the 20th century. He was kind of an intellectual rock star. He was the theologian to the Kennedys. He was the theologian of the liberal elite. And he said the following. He said, "Rationality belongs to the cool observer, but because of the stupidity of the average man, he follows not reason, but faith. And the naive faith requires necessary illusions and emotionally potent oversimplifications which are provided by the myth maker to keep the ordinary person on course. So the reason I go into that is that the environmental movement is not immune to emotionally potent oversimplifications. We have a continual stream of oversimplifications coming our way, and we buy into things that are half true. A lot of this mythology comes to us thanks to industrial civilization, thanks to the ruling elites, etc. But I digress. But let's be on the lookout for half-truths that come to us in the form of emotionally potent oversimplifications, one of which is all we have to do is reduce carbon emissions. And if we don't reduce carbon emissions, we're going to continue to warm the planet. And all of which is true, but the people who are crying and screaming and gnashing their teeth the most about carbon emissions don't have a plan for reducing carbon emissions. You're not going to reduce carbon emissions if the economy is constantly expanding, because if the economy is constantly expanding, then you're continually growing the amount of energy that's used. And solar and wind just don't have the capacity. For one thing, they don't have the capacity to displace fossil fuels. For another thing, they require fossil fuel. Even if we switch to solar and wind, we would still be using a lot of fossil fuels. And even if we switch to solar and wind, doesn't mean we would be using less fossil fuels, which is another conversation. But the idea is that electric cars are just business as usual, not only in the amount of energy consumption, but in the continually expanding economy, the amount of mining and the pollution and the deforestation and the water pollution that are produced by mining. Also, electric cars represent business as usual in relation to roads, and electric cars represent business as usual in terms of governance or decision-making power. The same group of people who got us this, who got us into this mess are the same group of people are going to retain all of the decision-making power and all of the control. So let's get into this article by the New York Times and see what it's about. I'm going to put this on, click on that, and it says the Biden administration announces rule aimed at expanding electric vehicles. So the federal government is going to expand electric vehicles, which would be fine if this were something that actually aimed at actual solutions. But it says the regulation would essentially require automakers to sell more electric vehicles and hybrids by gradually tightening limits on tailpipe pollution. The idea here is that tailpipe pollution is a major contributor to carbon dioxide emissions and therefore climate change. And it is, but it's only a small part of the picture. Here's an American flag, and the EPA Administrator Michael S. Regan unveils new rules in Washington on Wednesday. So it says the Biden administration on Wednesday issued one of the most significant climate regulations in the nation's history. So climate regulations, the reason they're able to get away with calling this a climate regulation is because of the emotionally potent oversimplifications I was telling you about, which equates climate change to CO2 and CO2 to fossil fuels. CO2 is not the only cause of climate change. Climate change is not the only environmental problem. fossil fuels are not the only cause of CO2. CO2 is not only not the only cause of global warming, but it's not the only cause of climate dysregulation. It's not the only reason or the primary reason, in my view, why we have flooding and drought and heat waves and wildfires and the things that are associated with climate change. But nonetheless, the Biden administration gets away with calling this a climate regulation because so many people have been seduced by emotionally potent oversimplifications. This is a rule designed to ensure that the majority of new passenger cars and light trucks sold in the United States are all electric or hybrids by 2032. Nearly 3 years in the making, the new tailpipe pollution limits for the Environmental Protection Agency would transform the American automobile market. A record 1.2 million electric vehicles rolled off dealers' lots last year, but they made up just 7.6% of total U.S. car sales, far from the 56% target under the new regulation. An additional 16% of new cars sold would be hybrids. So they're issuing regulations that require automakers to have a certain percentage of their fleets that are dedicated to electric cars and hybrids. They're presumably going to measure the amount of tailpipe emissions from, per vehicle. And in order to make the tailpipe emissions per vehicle go down, you have to have more electric cars and more hybrids. It sounds nice. It's just so far removed from what really does damage to our green planet and our green and blue planet. Green meaning the plants and blue meaning the ocean. So it says cars and other forms of transportation are together the largest single source of carbon emissions generated by the United States, pollution that is driving climate change and that helped to make 2023 the hottest year in recorded history. So when it says the largest single source of carbon emissions, it's like cars and other forms of transportation are the largest single source of carbon emissions. So we're going to say cars and air travel, cars and air travel and trains, put them all together, and they're the largest single source of carbon emissions. But we're not going to do anything about trains, and we're not going to do anything about air travel. We're just going to focus on electric vehicles. And notice that electric vehicles are a profitable corporate product. But it says it's the largest, so transportation is the largest single source of carbon emissions generated by the United States. Pollution that is driving climate change. So we're going to say carbon dioxide is driving climate change. I think that is an emotionally potent oversimplification. But it says electric vehicles are central to President Biden's strategy to confront global warming. So let's look at that sentence right there. Electric vehicles are central to President Biden's strategy to confront global warming. So this is the language of leadership. Keep in mind that the New York Times is a mouthpiece for the Democratic Party. So anything President Biden is doing confronting global warming, that sounds like leadership. But anyway, electric vehicles are central to President Biden's strategy to confront global warming. So let's talk about this idea of whether electric vehicles should be central to President Biden's strategy for confronting global warming. So the thing about electric vehicles is that it's something that you can champion without really changing business as usual. What needs to happen that is not happening in relation to climate change, in relation to the environment, in relation to social justice, what needs to happen that is not happening is the ability to confront industry, the ability to say no to industry, the ability to say no to the super wealthy for whom industry is a tool and a means and a mechanism for concentrating their wealth and concentrating their power. So here is a quick list of things we're not talking about. We're going to talk about electric vehicles, and President Biden is going to confront global warming, and he's being a real leader here. But what he's not doing, he's not confronting the food or farming. Massive amounts of nitrogen fertilizers, chemical fertilizers that go into agriculture such as it is. We're not going to talk about that. We're not going to talk about the heavy amount. We're not going to talk about the damage we do to our soils and how much that contributes to carbon dioxide emissions. We're not going to talk about deforestation. We're not going to confront the industry or the individuals that benefit from deforestation. We're not going to talk about the industries or the individuals that benefit from intense transportation that makes up the food system and the agricultural system that delivers food to our restaurants or to our groceries. We're not going to change anything about that system that might be better for people or better for the planet, even though this food system succeeds in delivering toxic food. We're not going to talk about that. We're not going to talk about the tendency, food, farming. And I'm not picking on small farmers. It's industrialized farming is what we've got here. We're not going to talk about, what else? Media. We're not going to talk about technology. We're not going to talk about just an out of control system where I'm not going to use the word capitalism because it means different things to different people. Is capitalism General Electric, or is it the corner grocery store? A locally owned business, a small local farm. But what we have is a situation where money calls the shots. Whenever money calls the shots, you have corruption. Whenever you have corruption, you have just massive amounts of pollution, massive amounts of destruction. Oh, another thing we're not going to confront is the people who benefit from the oceans, from overfishing, from deep sea mining, from drilling in the oceans, people who benefit from the transportation that takes place. I just interviewed a guest, Julia Barnes, who's an expert on the oceans. She did the movie Sea of Life, and she says at any point in time, there are 50,000 container ships that are traveling on the oceans. And that causes a lot of pollution. There's a lot of carbon dioxide emissions that come from that. But we're not going to talk about the container ships. We're not going to talk about the 50,000 container ships on the ocean, these massive boats. There's never been bigger boats than the massive container ships that we have on our oceans. And we're not going to talk about that. We're not going to confront the people who profit from 50,000 container ships at a time on our oceans, but we are going to sell electric cars because it's a profitable corporate product, and you can be a politician and support that product, and you can pretend to be clean, green, and environmentally friendly, even though at the end of the day, it's none of that. It's very little of that, and it's a lot of stuff that they're not talking about and they're not telling you about. But let's go back to the article. So it says, EVs have become politicized and are flashpoint in the 2024 presidential campaign. So this is the New York Times. I'm reading from the New York Times. The New York Times is partisan. The New York Times is pro-Biden and anti-Trump, and don't even get me started on the two-party duopoly. It's like George Galloway says, it's two cheeks of the same backside. But we're going to pretend that one side are the good guys, or at least one side are the lesser of two evils. It says 3 years ago, talking about President Biden saying in a statement, 3 years ago, I set an ambitious target that half of all new cars and trucks sold in 2030 would be zero emission. That's an interesting concept, zero emission. Remember, I told you that 2/3 of the pollution associated with a car comes before it rolls off the assembly line. To take an electric car with all of its electronic gadgetry and all the mining that it takes, you still have the windshield glass and the windows that have to be manufactured somewhere. You have lots of aluminum, you have copper wiring, you have plastic, you have vinyl, you have the headlights and the taillights, and that all have to be manufactured somewhere, and all the transportation that has to take place, all the smelting, the energy intensive process of manufacturing that vehicle. To call that zero emission is ludicrous, and it's also an emotionally potent oversimplification that Reinhold Niebuhr talked about when he's celebrating the opportunity of intellectuals and the elite class to manipulate average people because they don't know what's good for them, and they have to be led by emotionally potent oversimplifications. The idea of zero emission is an emotionally potent oversimplification. Together, we've made historic progress. Hundreds of new expanded factories across the country. Okay, let's talk about hundreds of new expanded factories across the country. So the Biden administration is saying, we're going to have hundreds of new expanded factories across the country. When I see hundreds of new expanded factories across the country, I think it takes a whole lot of energy to build new factories and expand new factories. We're building a whole new infrastructure for electric vehicles. And you have to look at how the sausage is made. You have to look at the entire supply chain before you know what is really going on in terms of carbon emissions, in terms of pollution, in terms of new roads that have to be built, new devices that have to be manufactured, all the people going to work to build new factories. We would do better in many cases to pay such people to stay at home, because it's out of the frying pan into the fire. It's business as usual. It is not a new thing or a better thing. The more things change, the more they stay the same. So it says, we're going to have hundreds of new expanded factories across the country, hundreds of billions in private investment, and thousands of good paying union jobs. Okay. it's almost as if they say they're going to be good paying union jobs just because. I mean, if President Biden were concerned about good paying union jobs, he would not have broken the rail workers strike in late 2022. It's just fanciful to think that this president is concerned about good paying union jobs when this is the type of president who is, this is the president who is a full-throated supporter of NAFTA, which was an assault on the working class. Chris Hedges says that NAFTA is the biggest assault on the working class since the Taft-Hartley Act of 1947, which kind of, took the kneecaps out of union organizing. And so, okay, billions in private investment. So what we're doing here is celebrating the ability of Wall Street to extract from our economy. It's just on its face, it screams business as usual. It celebrates business as usual. And it says, and will meet my goal for 2030 and race forward in the years ahead. The rule increasingly limits the amount of pollution allowed from tailpipes over time. Okay, let's go on down here. Okay, here's a good one. The transition to electric vehicles would require enormous changes in manufacturing, infrastructure, technology, labor, global trade, and consumer habits. So that's what I'm talking about. If this requires enormous changes in manufacturing and infrastructure, that means we're going to be doing a lot of mining. We're going to be burning a lot of fossil fuels, doing a lot of mining, polluting a lot of water, deforesting a lot of forests. We're going to be, increasing the 50,000 container ships that are on our oceans at any given point in time, burning bunker fuel. And so that's why I say this is business as usual. Electric cars are not a departure from business as usual. It's more of the same. It's the more things change, the more they stay the same. And that's all I have to say about that. I hope you got something out of this. If you want to follow my work, please go to harthagen.substack.com. Also, please like and subscribe to my YouTube channel. I'm at 950 YouTube subscribers. Would like to get to 1,000 very soon. Thanks and have a great day.